Dan just wanted to keep his porch light on for safety, until HOA Chair Lorraine accused him of attracting bears and tried to fine him out of the neighborhood. She weaponized fake rules and even filed a wildlife report to shut him down. But when real rangers arrived, they found her floodlights were the real threat and hit her with state penalties. Wait until you hear how the tables turned and why justice landed exactly where it belonged. When Dan Thompson first moved into the quiet, pine-shrouded neighborhood of Pine Hollow, he was expecting a fresh chapter. After retiring from 20 years of service as a firefighter and wilderness rescue volunteer, Dan was looking for peace, clean air, and room to stretch out with Scout, his German Shepherd and longtime rescue partner. He bought a modest log cabin at the edge of the community, where the woods thinned just enough for sunrise to hit his porch by morning. It was the kind of place you'd imagine in a postcard: birdsong, trails within walking distance, neighbors who mostly kept to themselves. Dan wasn't one to stir trouble. He spent his first week unpacking, fixing a leaky gutter, and installing his preferred porch light, a motion-activated amber LED, specifically chosen because it was rated as wildlife safe. He'd used that same model on dozens of search and rescue bases. The soft glow helped with late-night visibility without disorienting nocturnal animals. For Dan, it wasn't just convenience. It was part of his routine and a quiet nod to a life spent protecting others. So, when a pale yellow envelope appeared taped to his front door just 7 days after moving in, it caught him off guard. The letter inside was typed, stamped with an HOA seal, and signed Lorraine Whitaker, Chair of Compliance Committee. The message was as sharp as it was strange. Your property's exterior lighting has been reported for attracting large predators, specifically bears. This constitutes a violation of community light protocols. Please remove the fixture within 24 hours to avoid fines. Dan blinked. Bears? From his porch light? He scanned the paper again, wondering if this was some kind of prank. But the wording was dead serious, right down to the vague mention of natural light integrity, a rule he'd never heard of and couldn't find anywhere in the bylaws. The next morning, Dan caught sight of her, Lorraine Whitaker, late 60s, crisp sun hat, clipboard always in hand, walking a rigid loop past his cabin with a frown carved into her face like granite. She didn't wave. She didn't nod. She just stared at his porch light like it had personally insulted her. Later that week, she knocked on his door with a camera printout and a story. I personally witnessed a black bear sniffing near your trash bin, she said, voice clipped, and I believe your light was the cause. These animals are drawn to light. This neighborhood does not tolerate negligence. Dan tried to explain, gently, that bears were drawn by smell, not lighting, and that his fixture was approved for use near wildlife corridors. He even offered to share the certification. But Lorraine wasn't interested in discussion. She turned on her heel and left with a parting shot. Remove it, Mr. Thompson, or we'll start with daily citations. As her footsteps disappeared down the gravel road, Dan stood frozen in the doorway, caught between disbelief and rising frustration. The irony? That very week, he'd just completed a volunteer refresher course on wilderness lighting standards. And Lorraine's complaint? It wasn't just misinformed, it was fabricated. There was no rule against wildlife-certified motion lighting. But in Pine Hollow, it seemed, rules didn't need to be real to be enforced. Dan folded the letter and tucked it into his rescue jacket pocket. He'd seen blizzards, wildfires, and mountain accidents. But this was going to be a different kind of fight. At first, Dan thought the porch light complaint might have been a one-off. Maybe Lorraine was just overly cautious. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. But that illusion didn't last. Within days, neighbors started quietly warning him. She's got it out for you, said a retired schoolteacher 2 cabins down. She doesn't like outsiders, added another. But the real kicker? Lorraine, it seemed, had a special distaste for anyone who didn't fall in line with her idea of order. And Dan, with his military-cut hair, rescue vest, and nighttime dog runs, didn't fit her mold. What grated on her the most was Scout. Scout wore a medical alert tag and responded to specialized emergency commands. To Dan, he was more than a companion. He was a partner. To Lorraine, he was a distraction, as she once muttered during a board meeting, and an unapproved animal, even though the HOA documents allowed registered working dogs without restriction. She began escalating in subtle, targeted ways. Dan started finding printed notices folded into his mailbox, unsigned but clearly her doing. Photos of his cabin at night captured from the edge of the tree line, red ink notes scrawled across the bottom, exceeds allowable lumens, violates wildlife tranquility hours. Reported for elevated animal risk zone. None of it matched anything in the official rule book. Still, she forwarded the complaints to the HOA board, each one titled with loaded terms like potential wildlife risk and non-compliance escalation. Dan showed up to the next community meeting prepared, with the lighting regulations in hand and his fixtures certification documents. He waited his turn, stood calmly, and began to explain. But Lorraine cut him off before he reached his second sentence. "If the bears come back," she snapped, her voice icy and theatrical, "we'll know who to sue." There was a moment of silence in the room. Even the board members shifted uncomfortably. But no one challenged her. Not openly. Not yet. It didn't stop there. Days later, Dan received a notice from the county wildlife office itself. A formal inspection was being scheduled in response to a citizen complaint, accusing him of knowingly maintaining attractants and creating a predatory risk zone via artificial lighting. Lorraine had filed it directly with the State Conservation Authority. She hadn't just weaponized the HOA, she had gone a step further, reaching outside the neighborhood to bring in state-level scrutiny. Dan felt the heat of real pressure now. An official inspection could carry real consequences, penalties, restrictions, even citations on public record. He knew he'd done nothing wrong, but it no longer felt like that mattered. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was personal. And the woman who had declared war on his porch light wasn't done fighting. What she didn't realize, though, was that in dragging government officials into her vendetta, she'd finally picked a fight she couldn't control. It was a crisp Thursday afternoon when Dan pulled into his gravel driveway and spotted the official Wildlife Ranger Service truck parked near his fence. The seal on the door was unmistakable. State authority, not HOA theater. 2 officers stepped out as he approached. One of them, a woman in her 30s with a clipboard and calm, steady posture, introduced herself with a small professional nod. "Ranger Alexis Grant," she said. "We're here following up on a citizen complaint about potential wildlife attractants on your property. Do you mind if we take a look?" Dan didn't flinch. Not at all. What followed was a full sweep, by the book. The officers measured the brightness and angle of his porch light, inspected the motion trigger sensitivity, and even checked how securely he stored his trash and compost. Scout watched them from the porch steps, tail thumping slowly but alert. After 20 minutes, Ranger Grant glanced at her partner and smiled. "Sir," she said with a note of amused admiration, "this setup is better than what we see at most ranger cabins. No food waste outside, no standing attractants. And that light? It's fully shielded and wildlife rated." Dan gave a relieved nod. "That's what I've been trying to say for weeks." But then came the unexpected shift. Ranger Grant flipped a page on her clipboard. "Unfortunately," she added, "we also need to check the property listed in the original complaint. Miss Lorraine Whitaker stated there were increased wildlife sightings in her area, which means we have to examine her lighting as well." Dan raised an eyebrow. "You mean her house?" "Yes," the ranger said. "It's procedure." Within the hour, they were back, with a completely different report. Lorraine's house, perched dramatically on a slope just a block over, was a beacon of contradictions. Where Dan's cabin blended into the forest, hers stood out like a cruise ship in the woods. The rangers documented every corner. Unregulated floodlights blasted the hillside in 4 directions. Bright white halogen lamps buzzed nonstop, even during daylight hours. And worst of all, high-powered motion strobes triggered with every rustle, casting flashes into the treetops like a searchlight drill. It wasn't just bad, it was a violation on multiple counts. "Direct breach of hillside preservation regulations," one of the officers muttered, and excessive light pollution inside a designated wildlife corridor? The irony hit hard. For all her talk of Dan's porch light inviting predators, it was Lorraine's house that had been doing the damage. According to the ranger's initial findings, her light system was likely disorienting nocturnal wildlife, bears included, and pushing them off the ridge straight down toward the lower lots, toward Dan's cabin. Dan didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He just watched as the officers packed up their gear and walked back to their truck, one of them shaking their head. "Some folks really ought to read their own complaints before filing them," one said under their breath. The anger that had been simmering in Dan for days didn't explode. It focused. He'd been framed as the problem, threatened with fines, and publicly embarrassed. And the whole time, the real source of danger had been sitting just one block uphill, lighting up the forest like a runway. But now the spotlight had shifted. 1 month later, the changes were impossible to ignore. Lorraine Whitaker's house no longer blazed with light like a mountaintop theater. By direct order of the County Wildlife Authority, her property had been retrofitted with state-regulated motion floodlights, shielded, narrow beam, and programmed to shut off after just 90 seconds of inactivity. They pointed straight down and not an inch beyond her property line. She hadn't paid for the install by choice. The retrofitting came as part of her penalty, accompanied by a $1,200 citation for both false reporting and excessive light contamination inside a protected wildlife corridor. On top of that, she was required to attend a wildlife compliance seminar, run by the very agency she'd tried to weaponize. Neighbors noticed, so did the HOA. Where Lorraine once held court at monthly meetings, interrupting others and citing imaginary infractions, she now sat silent, her clipboard replaced by a polite, folded agenda and a brittle smile. Her reputation, once rigid and commanding, had crumbled. People no longer avoided crossing her. They simply stopped listening altogether. The board, sensing the shift in tone among residents, took the unusual step of issuing a formal letter to Dan. An apology, not just for the mishandling of the complaints, but for allowing an unverified crusade to escalate under their watch. They passed a vote to revise the lighting guidelines altogether, striking Lorraine's fabricated clauses from the community handbook. From now on, all enforcement would require documented code references and real evidence. Dan didn't grandstand. He didn't gloat. But when they asked if he'd consider heading a new safety and wilderness readiness subcommittee, he quietly agreed. By spring, neighbors began turning to him for advice on fire prep, on secure storage, on how to responsibly coexist with wildlife. He shared what he knew without judgment, just like he'd always done on rescue teams. And every evening, as dusk crept across the pine-lined hills, Dan's porch light flickered on. Amber, motion-activated, shielded, just bright enough to see Scout resting by the stairs, ears perked toward the woods. There were still bears in Pine Hollow, caught on trail cams from time to time, lumbering far above the ridgelines. But they didn't come near Dan's house anymore. And as for Lorraine, her deck now sat in a pool of regulation-approved darkness, quiet, dim, and finally compliant, the way she'd insisted others should be all along.